On a foggy night, Daniel Calloway stood on a rusty bridge that spanned the dark river. His breathing was heavy, his fingers clutching an old briefcase. Beside him, leaning on the railing, was Mr. Whitmore, his former employer. The old man was weak, but his voice was calm as he said, "Daniel, you were like a son to me. Whatever is troubling you, we can solve it together." Daniel's heart raced. Inside the briefcase were documents that would make him the sole owner of Whitmore's company. A quick impulse, a sudden push, and Whitmore fell backward. A scream tore through the night, followed by a loud splash. Daniel froze. His plan had worked, or had it? A low growl broke the silence. From the shadows emerged Toby, Whitmore's loyal German shepherd. His amber eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made him shudder. "Good boy," Daniel whispered, trembling. Toby didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't move. Then abruptly he turned and disappeared into the darkness. Daniel's mind raced. Had Toby understood what had happened? A dog was just a dog, right? He wiped his forehead, took Whitmore's cane, and threw it over the railing. Then he got into his car and drove back to the estate, where he would play the concerned employee searching for his missing boss. When he entered the house, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel went to the study to prepare his story, but there, sitting by the fireplace, was Toby. His fur was still damp from the rain, his gaze unwavering, fixed on Daniel with accusation and an eerie silence. Daniel stepped back. "Good boy," he said again, but Toby didn't react. Instead, his eyes remained locked on Daniel, as if he knew everything. Time passed agonizingly slowly as Daniel felt the weight of Toby's gaze. The next morning, news of Whitmore's disappearance spread. The police were called, and Daniel played his part convincingly. But one thing made him nervous. Toby followed him everywhere. At night, Daniel heard the soft padding of paws outside his door, and occasionally a deep growl from the darkness. The dog never left his side, as if ensuring Daniel knew he wasn't alone. 3 days later, Detective Sarah arrived at the estate. She was known for solving even the most complex cases. As she petted Toby, the dog relaxed for the first time since Whitmore's disappearance. "A loyal companion," she remarked. "Animals often know more than we think." Her eyes met Daniel's, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. He forced a smile, but inside, panic was brewing. The search for Whitmore yielded no results, but Toby grew increasingly restless. Every time Daniel tried to leave the house, the dog blocked the door. At night, he appeared suddenly at Daniel's window, his amber eyes glowing in the moonlight like living accusations. Daniel could barely stand the tension. He began sleeping poorly, and his own reflection in the windows seemed to mock him. What if Toby really had evidence? Finally, he decided to act. In a desperate move, he drove Toby deep into the woods and left him there. "You'll be fine here," he whispered. Toby looked at him for a moment, then slowly turned and disappeared among the trees. Relieved, Daniel drove away, believing his problem was solved. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. But the next morning, he was awakened by loud knocking. Detective Sarah stood at the door. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway. I wanted to talk to you about Toby." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah handed him a photo. Toby at the sheriff's office, holding something in his mouth. Whitmore's cane. "We're testing it for fingerprints," Sarah said with a piercing look. "Maybe Toby can help us figure out what really happened." Daniel's heart raced. Toby had returned, and he had brought evidence. Daniel tried to stay calm, but his stomach churned. "I don't understand. How did Toby—" "He showed up at the sheriff's office this morning alone," Sarah interrupted. "He barked until someone let him in. He knew exactly what he was doing." Daniel forced a laugh. "Maybe he just wanted to come home. Dogs do that." Sarah studied him. "Or maybe he wanted to make sure we didn't forget about the case. Toby seems like a smart dog. I'm curious what else he might show us." Daniel's neck prickled with fear. Toby hadn't just found him. He had brought back the most crucial piece of evidence. And if the dog knew more, his nightmare was just beginning. Toby had returned, and he had brought Whitmore's cane. That single fact was enough to send Daniel into a panic. As Sarah examined the photo, he tried to gather his thoughts. How could a dog act so deliberately? Was it just a coincidence, or was there more to it? "It's interesting, isn't it?" Sarah said as she looked at the cane. A dog bringing evidence so purposefully. It's almost as if he's trying to tell us something. Daniel forced a smile. Dogs act on instinct. Maybe he was just looking for something familiar. Sarah gave him a cool look. Perhaps, but in my career, I've learned that instinct often reveals the truth long before evidence does. With those words, she left, but Daniel knew she would be watching him. As he closed the door, he sank into a chair. He needed a plan before everything fell apart. That night, he was awakened by a soft scratching at his door. He sat up abruptly, his heart racing. Hesitantly, he got up and opened the door a crack. Toby sat there, his gaze fixed on him. The silence between them was almost palpable. "What do you want?" Daniel whispered. Toby didn't react. Instead, he stood up, turned, and slowly trotted away. Daniel swallowed hard. He couldn't sleep. Every sound made him jump. Over and over, he thought of the bridge, Whitmore's scream, the splash of water. In the morning, there was another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't Toby, but Sarah. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway. I just wanted to let you know we're planning a search of the estate. Standard procedure in a missing persons case." Daniel could barely suppress the trembling in his fingers. "Of course, I want Whitmore found as much as you do." Sarah studied him for a moment. "Good. Then you won't mind if we take a look around today." Internally, Daniel cursed his luck. They were closing in, and he knew he had to do something. As the officers began searching the grounds, Daniel watched from a distance. Toby was by their side, sniffing around, seeming to know exactly what he was looking for. Suddenly, he started digging. Daniel felt his blood run cold. Within minutes, the police uncovered a golden pocket watch in the soil. It was Whitmore's, unmistakable due to the engraved initials. Sarah picked it up and examined it with narrowed eyes. "Interesting. Why would Mr. Whitmore's watch be buried here?" All eyes turned to Daniel. He tried to hide his panic. "I have no idea. Maybe he lost it." Sarah looked at him for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps, but we'll have the watch tested for fingerprints. Let's see who it really belongs to." Daniel knew time was running out. He needed to come up with something, but then came another unexpected twist. A mysterious message was sent to his phone. No number, no name, just a short, ominous sentence. "I saw what you did. Meet me at the bridge." Daniel stared at the screen, his heart racing. Someone knew. He couldn't help but tremble. Who could it be? Had someone been watching him? Why had this message only appeared now? 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind as he tried to come up with an excuse. Maybe it was just a prank, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. He glanced out the window. Toby sat in the garden, his eyes gleaming in the faint morning light. It was as if the dog was challenging him. A shiver ran down his spine. Daniel had no choice. He had to find out who was blackmailing him. That night, he drove to the bridge. The fog hung thick over the water, and the silence was oppressive. His heart pounded as he waited. Footsteps echoed through the darkness, and a figure emerged from the shadows. "I knew you'd come, Daniel," said a calm but eerie voice. Daniel took a step back. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The figure stepped closer, their face half hidden in shadow. "I want you to pay for what you've done. And believe me, I won't be alone." Another sound made Daniel turn. He wasn't just facing one person. There were several. The fog seemed to close in around him, and for a moment he felt a suffocating sense that his end was near. Then he heard a familiar growl. "Toby." Daniel stood frozen on the bridge, Toby's low growl ringing in his ears. The dog had returned, and he wasn't alone. The figure before him stepped closer, their face still obscured. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" The voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. Daniel struggled to maintain his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." A dry laugh. "Oh, you know exactly. Whitmore, the bridge, the water." The figure paused, then pointed at Toby. "And he saw everything." Toby growled again, his amber eyes glowing in the darkness. Daniel took a step back. "What do you want from me? Money? Silence? We can make a deal." "I don't want a deal," the figure replied. "I want justice." Suddenly, the distant wail of police sirens filled the air. Daniel turned abruptly, his heart pounding. "You called the police?" "No," the figure said calmly, "but it seems someone else did. Maybe your conscience finally caught up with you. Or maybe it was Toby who betrayed you." Daniel panicked. He couldn't be arrested. Not now. Not like this. In a desperate attempt, he turned and ran. The shadows of the night swallowed him, the echo of his footsteps ringing across the bridge. But Toby was faster. The dog sprinted after him, his barking piercing the silence. Daniel stumbled, falling hard on the wet pavement. He tried to get up, but suddenly Toby was on him, a deep growl vibrating in his throat. "Stay back!" Daniel cried, shielding his face with his arms. But Toby didn't move. He just stared at him, and that stare was worse than any bite. It was the stare of a creature that knew. The sirens grew louder. Soon the police would be there. Daniel was cornered. He stared at Toby, his breathing ragged. "Let me go," he pleaded. "You're just a dog." But Toby remained, his gaze unyielding. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then red and blue lights lit up the night. Footsteps hurried closer, voices shouting orders. Daniel raised his hands as he was surrounded. "Daniel Calloway, you're under arrest." The handcuffs clicked, and Daniel knew it was over. As he was led to the police car, he saw Toby one last time. The dog stood motionless, his fur glowing in the light of the headlights, and in his eyes was something Daniel would never forget: the triumph of justice. The interrogations began that same night. Daniel sat in a cold room under harsh lighting, facing Detective Sarah. Her gaze was steady, almost pitiless. "We have enough evidence against you, but if you cooperate, it could lighten your sentence." Daniel remained silent. He knew his silence was futile. The evidence Toby had brought was more than enough. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to kill him." Sarah leaned back. "But you did. And Toby made sure we knew." Daniel ran a trembling hand over his face. "That dog, he never let me out of his sight. It was like he'd sworn it to Whitmore." Sarah nodded slowly. "Maybe he did. Sometimes the truest friends are the last to give up." After the case was closed, Toby was officially adopted. He was celebrated as a hero, and his story spread through the news. The loyal dog who helped bring a murderer to justice. When he was brought to Sarah's home, she looked into his eyes. "You did it, Toby. Without you, none of this would have come to light." Toby tilted his head, then wagged his tail. For the first time in weeks, he seemed truly at ease. He knew his job was done. Weeks had passed since Daniel Calloway's arrest. The case had caused a stir throughout the city. Newspapers reported on Whitmore's murder, Daniel's greed, and Toby, the dog who had uncovered the truth. The courtroom was packed when the verdict was read. The jury had quickly reached a decision: guilty of second-degree murder. A murmur swept through the room. Daniel sat motionless, as if still unable to grasp that it was over. But his eyes betrayed him. They flickered with anger, fear, and resignation. Sarah sat in the audience, Toby quietly by her side. He had done his job. As Daniel was led away, he turned his gaze to Toby one last time. The dog met his stare with unshakable calm. Daniel looked as if he wanted to say something, but then he lowered his head and disappeared through the door with the guards. After the trial, Sarah stayed in the courtroom for a while. She felt a strange emptiness. The case was solved, but something told her not all questions had been answered. Had Daniel acted alone, or were there others involved? The investigation had focused on him, but there were hints of corruption within the company. A few days later, Whitmore's will was opened. It contained a surprise. A large portion of his estate was dedicated to a newly founded animal welfare fund, with Toby as its mascot. Sarah smiled. "Whitmore knew what he was doing," she said to Toby, who tilted his head as if understanding every word. But one question remained. Why had Whitmore made this decision? Had he suspected betrayal from someone close to him? And what did Daniel really know? Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that another chapter of this story was yet to be written. In the weeks following the trial, life slowly returned to normal. Toby was celebrated as a hero, and many wanted to see him. But for Sarah, it was more important to give him a peaceful home. She took him to her house, where he finally had a stable place to live. At first he was restless, often standing at the door as if waiting for someone, but over time his anxiety faded. On a cool autumn evening, Sarah sat on her porch with a cup of tea, Toby at her feet. "You saw it all, didn't you?" she whispered. Toby lifted his head and looked at her with his intelligent eyes. "Maybe you know more than we think." A soft bark was his reply. Sarah laughed and scratched his fur. "No matter what happens, we found the truth, and we owe it to you." But the story wasn't quite over. When Sarah arrived at her office the next day, a message was waiting for her, an anonymous letter on her desk. No sender, just a short line. "There's more to discover. Look at the old files." Sarah frowned. What could this mean? She had thought everything was resolved with Daniel's arrest, but this message hinted at something else. She took out the files and began sifting through the old documents from Whitmore's company. Hours passed until she found a suspicious lead, a series of bank transfers to an unknown account, large sums that had disappeared shortly before Whitmore's death. Her heart raced. Had Daniel not acted alone? Was his betrayal part of a larger plan? Sarah knew she had to dig deeper, but now wasn't the time. She leaned back and looked at Toby, who lay patiently by her side. "What do you think, boy? Are we really done?" Toby blinked as if understanding the weight of her words. The truth had come to light, but perhaps there was still more waiting to be discovered. A few days later, Sarah visited Whitmore's old mansion. She had a feeling that more clues might be hidden there. As she walked through the deserted rooms, she felt the weight of the past. Dust covered the furniture, and the air smelled of old wood and forgotten memories. Toby followed her attentively. In the study, she stopped. This was where Whitmore had often sat, with Toby by his side. She went to the desk, opened a drawer, and found an old notebook. The pages were yellowed, but the handwriting was clear. Whitmore had written down his thoughts and a final warning. "I fear someone close to me wants me gone. If something happens to me, seek the truth. Toby will know who to trust." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Whitmore had suspected something was coming. Perhaps he hadn't known it would be Daniel, but he had sensed danger. She closed the notebook and looked down at Toby. "You were his loyal friend to the end, and now you're making sure his story isn't forgotten." Toby wagged his tail slightly, his eyes full of intelligence and calm. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. The town had found its peace, but for Sarah it was clear. The past could never fully rest. And perhaps, just perhaps, Toby would continue to help bring the truth to light in the future. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thanks to our valued viewers, we continue to improve every day. Please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up.